Very good afternoon, and welcome to this policy dialogue on investing in nature positive action in Europe, the role of policies and financial instruments, organized by the European Policy Centre with the support from the UK mission to the European Union. My name is Stefan Šipka. I'm head of EPC Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Healthy ecosystems are important for climate action, but they also are important to address biodiversity loss, which is a challenge on its own, another existential crisis we are facing. The EU has already developed a comprehensive policy framework dating back to the 1970s and also conclusive with the latest policy developments, including the nature restoration law and related legislation. However, nature in Europe is still, when it comes to nature protection, nature restoration, is still not at its adequate level. This is also linked to funding or lack of funding and investments. And given that we are faced with different trade-offs and shortages in terms of public funding, it is important to look into the opportunities on how to unlock private investments and use different kinds of financial instruments to advance nature positive action. So this is something that we will be focusing in today's discussion on where we are when it comes to EU's nature agenda and how can we look into possibilities to finance nature positive action, including also the role of private investments and other instruments. And to discuss this topic today, we will first have a discussion with our panelists, and then we will hear from a respondent on what we discussed initially, and then I will open the floor to our participants. I would, however, like to kindly invite our participants to think of their questions and to write them as soon as you can, so we can address as many of these questions as possible in the next 1 hour and a half. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first panelist for today, Sabine Liemans, Biodiversity Manager, the European Policy Office of the WWF. Sabine, thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to start by asking you on how do you assess the current landscape for financing nature positive action in the EU? And where do you see the momentum for this financing opportunities? Where are the biggest gaps between ambition and existing financial flows? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Good afternoon, everybody. Before diving into the content of financing, I think it's important to remind ourselves that nature is not just one of the many sectors that are important. It's really the foundation that makes our economy and our societies possible. And as you already mentioned, that's why nature laws like the Birds and the Habitats Directive and the Nature Restoration Regulation are important. The Birds and Habitats Directive provide the long-standing legal backbone for nature protection in Europe, and the adoption of the Nature Restoration Regulation added a clear framework and implementation pathway for restoration across member states. And this comes, of course, alongside with the growing recognition that nature conservation and restoration is not only important for biodiversity, but it matters for climate and water resilience, for disaster risk reduction, for health and long-term economic stability. And of course, laws must be backed by funding. And while we know that every euro we invest in nature restoration can generate around 8 to 38 euro of benefits to society, but nature remains critically underfunded also in the EU. And currently, when we talk about nature funding, it's mainly EU funding, because more than 50% of funding for biodiversity currently is coming from the EU budget. And private funding is still negligible, very small, around 1 to 2% currently. And so it's great that we discuss now how to leverage more private funding into nature, but I cannot avoid by voicing also our concern with the Commission's proposal on the next multi-annual financial framework, because from our perspective, this is not going to address the underfunding for nature, but it's going to make it even more problematic. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's very worrying that the LIFE program would be discontinued, because this is the only EU program dedicated exclusively to climate, nature, and environment. There is no dedicated spending target anymore for biodiversity, which has been a key driver in the current multi-annual financial framework, requiring member states to program funding towards biodiversity objectives. And so from our perspective, this needs to be addressed. But besides securing a continued sufficient level of public funding through the MFF, we also think we need to look at harmful subsidies, because actually the most impactful immediate way to use financing to protect and restore nature is to defund the damage caused to biodiversity by eliminating nature harming subsidies, and they are quite substantial also in Europe. All that being said, we will discuss nature credits also a lot, and we really feel that they can play a role in closing the funding gap for nature, but they can only complement and should not replace public funding, and they should not distract from the urgent need to eliminate subsidies harmful to nature.
Thank you very much, Sabine, on these initial points and needed for underlying the challenge posed by underfunded nature-related projects. And I mean, given the importance of nature, as we call it, a web of life and something that is sustaining our economy and society without us even being aware of it. But we would become aware of it once we really face say serious shortcomings and challenges when it comes to biodiversity loss and also climate-related challenges. It's important to bear in mind the importance of this the situation we find ourselves in now in the EU, but also beyond. And also I think it does start with a discussion on public funding and the MFF, and indeed the questions and remarks around LIFE and other instruments gain also attention, and also in the EU Brussels community and also beyond on the MFF as such. But also it's interesting what you pointed out too, that it's about public investments into looking into private investments and nature credit, the role of nature credit, but also discussing what are the investments that are not really adding to the solution, or the question around subsidies that are. So that's also part of the financial, say, of the discourse we should be mindful of when it comes to nature financing. But all that being said, if we indeed try to zoom in briefly into the question on nature credits. Last year, the Commission published its roadmap of nature credits. So we see that there is a movement in that direction that could arguably help complete that picture on nature investments. And I'm interested just in any comment you can have at this point, and we can discuss it further, of course. What role could these credits play, notwithstanding what you said already, but what role could it play mobilizing finance for nature positive action? What are the main barriers, and what are the main barriers in making them credible and investable?
Yeah. Yes. So I will try to limit on a few key points for the nature credits. First of all, from our perspective, the Commission roadmap does not give a lot of clarity on what the Commission exactly wants to do with the nature credits or how they want to approach it. But it seems that the focus is on voluntary approaches. And for WWF, it's really important to make the point that we need a strong regulatory framework when we are discussing nature credits. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is that a voluntary approach will come with higher risks of low quality projects and can even lead to greenwashing. And this is something that we can learn from the experience with voluntary carbon credits as well. So we think that a strong regulatory framework will be needed to ensure that all the recommendations for high integrity that exists around nature credits, to ensure that they are complied with. And the second reason is that we think that a voluntary system is not going to be able to drive the demand for the nature credits, because this demand for nature credits is not expected to grow substantively unless, in our view, nature credit mechanisms are associated with compliance mechanisms. So those are for us two important reasons why we think a voluntary system on its own will not be sufficient. And a last point that I would like to make, which is important to WWF, is that for us, it's very clear that nature credits should not be used for offsetting. Offsetting exists, it is there, but for us, we should not mix the discussion on offsetting with the discussion on nature credits. Offsetting is always associated, of course, with a negative impact because it aims to compensate for nature that has been destroyed or degraded. So it means that the harm has already occurred. And so, in our view, relying on offsetting to finance nature is not really a credible solution because it risks further degradation of nature. And we think that finance for nature needs to be available independently from biodiversity loss that we try to compensate. So those are a few main elements from our side, maybe to kick off the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your reflections indeed on this particular topic, which is the role and the prospects and challenges with nature credits. And happy. I mean, I would of course have a list of follow-up questions, and I will see how much we can cover, and of course how much we can discuss. Given the limited time, I think this is already very insightful what you mentioned on the importance of compliance, discussing voluntary or versus, let's say, more mandatory requirements and the generation of demand, the carbon, the offsetting more generally, and we can also discuss about that. But thank you for that. And also, I mean, I'm happy to have an open discussion with, also with you and the participants, to discuss how does this agenda, because it's very much about land and land management, and how do we use it in the best possible way. And there are also other either priorities or interests that is linked to either energy or agriculture, broader competitiveness issue, or housing. And it is, of course, a complex topic that we need to discuss and see how we can cope with the trade-offs, but also explore the synergies whenever we can. Although there are no easy solutions. So just saying, I'm happy to have any comments or questions on how do we find the best possible way to achieve our ambitions in a realistic way. But thanks, Sabine, for your interventions at this point. And now I'd like to turn to Ioana Ilieva, Policy Assistant at DG Agriculture, Rural Development from the European Commission. Thanks for joining us, and indeed, happy to hear your view on behalf of the Commission. And I would start with the question on where can the EU funding have the greatest catalytic impact, so be most effective in mobilizing private investments for nature, and how can the EU help build and communicate a compelling business case for nature that resonates across stakeholders? Of course, if you have any wider reflections on the current EU's nature restoration agenda, happy to hear from you at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to join the discussion today, and I'm very glad to see a strong interest in this important topic. So let me start with a simple but important point that nature and farming go hand in hand. Farmers are not only food producers, they are also stewards of land and natural resources, and they're on the front line of climate change. And in fact, the long-term resilience of our food systems depends on their ability to adapt to climate change, while at the same time protecting and restoring nature. We see currently many practices that deliver environmental benefits, such as improving soil health, better nutrient management, or restoring biodiversity. But all this requires significant upfront investment, while financial returns often materialize only later. So the question that is important to ask is, how do we make this transition economically viable for the farmer? And I think two elements are essential here. First, sharing the financial risk. We cannot expect farmers, landowners, foresters to carry the cost of transition alone. And second, rewarding them for delivering environmental benefits, including through new income opportunities created by the market. This, in substance, means that the cost and benefits of sustainability must be shared along the entire value chain, from the farmers to processors, retailers, investors, and ultimately the consumer. And to come to the question on the role of EU funding, this is where EU funding actually plays its most important catalytic role, exactly in de-risking the transition and in creating the conditions for private investment to follow. I can give an example with the EU agricultural sector. We are currently confronted with a significant financing gap, which has reached 62 billion euro in 2022 and has been increasing over time, especially for small and young farmers. The gap represents the unmet financing needs of farms due to the more difficult access that they have to bank finance. And to address this gap under the Common Agricultural Policy, member states can use financial instruments such as loan or guarantee schemes. These help farmers and agri-food businesses to access bank finance under more favorable terms, and thus they make the sustainable investment more accessible and less risky. In addition, under CAP, we have the risk management tools such as insurance schemes or mutual funds, which can help farmers cope with the increasing climate and market volatility. And actually, this provides safety net, which enables them to invest with greater confidence. These are only some examples of how our policy can help farmers reduce the financial risk linked to transition. So to summarize on your question, we see the role of EU funding that it works best when it reduces risks and creates the enabling conditions for private capital and also market incentives to scale up nature positive farming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanna, for your reflections on the role of EU. Also, as you said, I think what you emphasized indeed as the role in de-risking. So not necessarily just providing a full solution to addressing the gap, or notwithstanding the importance of public funding, but that it can also be connected and used as a lever to leverage private investments. Also, interesting points about insurance and different kinds of financial instruments that one can consider. And that indeed we need to see, to explore how we can work together. And when it comes to the agriculture sector, the farming sector, they're of course closely intertwined with nature restoration, but it also always becomes a money issue at some point. And this is an important point to consider, of course. And at that note, I mean, if we look at some maybe more concrete EU policy instruments, I don't know if you have would like to add anything on top, for example, which one of these instruments we could expect to play the biggest role in your view, mobilizing the funding for nature positive action. And we have CAP, right? CAP already had two major funding instruments, and there are additional instruments on top of that as part of the Common Agricultural Policy. But Sabine mentioned LIFE and its past and future role. but also the nature credits that are being developed. I don't know if there are any other more specific EU instruments that you would like to highlight as to their either existing or upcoming, or how can our participants also think about this and map their way when it comes to EU policy landscape on nature financing?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Looking ahead, of course, we need to see also the bigger framework that is created with the proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework, and the part that brings greater flexibility for member states through their national and regional partnership plans. This flexibility will let them combine different funding streams while better targeting them to the specific local needs. And something that is important is that they need to ensure that at least 43% of funding contributes to environmental and climate objectives. Within this bigger framework of the MFF, of course, our policy, the Common Agricultural Policy, will retain its central role as an instrument for improving the environmental and climate performance of farms and also land management. But this will be done through a simplified framework and incentive-based approach. To give an example, under the new green architecture, the proposed transition lump sum payment, which can reach up to 200,000 euros, can support farmers who commit to more transformative change. At the same time, as it was already pointed, public funding alone will never be sufficient to finance the scale of transition that is required. Its role is therefore not only to provide the funding, but also to play as a catalyst in reducing risk, creating these conditions for private capital to come and scale. In this context, financial instruments also under shared management will continue to play this important role in improving access to affordable finance for farmers and agri-food businesses. I would also mention one instrument that will continue in the future under the context of the new European Competitiveness Fund. This is the InvestEU program, which also can help accelerate innovation and bring solutions to the market, including in areas such as the bioeconomy. How it will work, just in short, by providing EU guarantees and financial instruments that can help leverage this additional private investment. And in this regard, we need the importance, we see the importance to work closely together with our institutional partners, such as the European Investment Bank, but also the national promotional banks and guarantee institutions, so that together we can scale up financing for nature positive investments. And maybe one last point, investments will only scale if there is a strong and credible business case on the ground, which means that we need to strengthen the revenue side for farmers, including through market-based income streams. Here we need to further explore the role potential trade-offs as Sabine already mentioned, of carbon or nature credits. There are also many value chain sustainability schemes or the new opportunities that we see linked to the bio-based products. And I think together all these elements can help unlock both public and private investment for nature restoration and positive action for the nature.
No, thank you very much, Joanna, also for shedding more light on, for example, some of the interesting relevant instruments that we could look into further. And what you said on the MFF, that there are certain targets or shares of the funding that are kind of mainstreaming climate and environmental objectives, or that it should be committed to meeting these objectives. And of course, we can discuss further about its mechanics and how is it envisaged and the details. But for now, this is already insightful. Also, the importance of the InvestEU that can indeed help unlock some of the private investment, provide the leverage with the help of the European Investment Bank, but also the importance of other financial actors. And also for mentioning now, and also in your previous remark, the importance of looking at the value chain, that this is I mean, it's in the end, we come back to nature and land management and the farmland, but we need to look at that this is part of a wider economic ecosystem, right? So we talk about products, we talk about suppliers, we talk about intermediaries. There are lots of things at play that is important for channelizing investments in the right direction. So of course, happy to follow up as much as we can, but thanks for now. And I would like to now turn to Glenn Anderson, who is a strategy lead and co-founder of the Wendling Back project. So a view from the practitioner, someone who is also someone who can share some more concrete experience when it comes to some of the financing schemes, especially developed in the UK, so we can also benefit from some comparative analysis, at least comparative insights that could be interesting also for further reflections on how we can develop the system in the EU. So Glenn, thanks for joining us. And then to start with the question on what is your experience? What does it reveal about financing nature positive action? The UK has developed its land management scheme, for example. So any reflections on that could be interesting also for our EU audience. What kinds of outcomes does this funding actually enable in practice?
Thank you, Stefan. So I'm actually a fifth generation farmer, so farming's in the blood, and we've taken a big transition in the last 6 years. So we started looking at a kind of a new model for farm business here. The Wendling Beck project is actually 4 farmers coming together to collaborate to deliver something a bit bigger and a bit better in terms of nature. And that's been quite a learning curve over the last few years alongside kind of policy evolution. In answer to your question, our experience of it is fundamentally positive. We've managed to deliver a massive amount actually on the ground in terms of nature. So we're transitioning about 800 hectares across what was 4 smallish family farms in the UK into generally 100% nature restoration within those farm businesses. We're on quite poor land. We're very conscious of that balance around food security and nature restoration as well. And it's 100% private finance. So in our case, compliance markets, so delivered through changes to government policy, in this case, biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality, and delivering nutrient mitigation credits for that. And actually, nutrient neutrality is an EU HABs directive legacy, if you like, which sort of came to the fore a couple of years ago. And that's enabled us to bring finance into the project quite rapidly. The way that those policies work is upfront finance. So you're tending to do a big chunk of upfront kind of feasibility, but then you're able to crystallize some of that money early in the process, and then it's about delivering that over the long term. So in our case, between sort of 30 and 100 years in terms of the legal mechanisms that work alongside that. So it's been overwhelmingly positive. We're very pleased with where we are at. Wendling is a 60 to 100 million pound project over the next 30 years. We're about 30 to 40% of the way through that pipeline at the moment as well, which, given that although the project's 6 years old, the policies have actually only been running for 18 months, 2 years. We're delighted with where we've got to. I do also wear another hat with a consultancy called Swallowtail, which has kind of really been created out of Wendling Beck because we were trying to help other landowners and scale and replicate some of that thinking. And we're currently working across about 300,000 hectares of other projects, much bigger landscape scale projects. And that tends to see more of a blend of finance. So public money, private money, and then more of a split between compliance markets. So policies which make it mandatory for developers generally to reinstate some of that habitat loss and then provide this net gain, this positive net gain as well. And then those voluntary markets such as carbon, but also working really hard with supply chain and trying to build resilience into farm businesses as well. So it's early days. The markets are relatively nascent. And the one thing I would say is there is no shortage of finance. There is no shortage of money to come into these projects. It's really actually surprisingly easy to generate finance into projects, as long as you've got some form of offtake in there. So as long as there's something to sell, these nature markets are no different from any other market. There's no mystery or magic to them. You have to be able to deliver something that somebody wants to buy. We're seeing a fairly rapid scale up in the carbon markets, actually, which is very welcome. But there are things that government can do from a policy perspective, even within those voluntary markets, to kind of the oil the wheels of how scaling and replicating investment into nature and that kind of delivery on the ground. But yeah, it's going really well. We're delighted with what we're delivering. It's high integrity. It's being monitored well above and beyond kind of minimum requirement, and it's working.
No, thanks for shedding more light on this scheme, which is, as I said, still at the beginning, more or less, and of course there is some time needed to assess its full effectiveness, but it's already insightful what you're saying, and because again, could be interesting either at the EU level or the member state level to consider this and to have a sort of a learning curve in that process. But just to ask you a bit more about the schemes and also how does it work from your perspective. I mean, I'm also building on what Sabine was saying, that it can be a challenge to create a demand for such products or solutions if we keep it voluntary. But maybe if you can say a bit more how it works in the UK and on the land management scheme. Is it voluntary? Are there any safeguards to ensure? Because you mentioned it's a secure financial flow and the markets are there, but what is actually backing it up? Is there in terms of how does it work that you can actually ensure that you get this funding, that there is a demand from the side of investors or financing? Anything that could be interesting in terms of the architecture, the functioning of this scheme that you are currently involved in as a practitioner. And you mentioned also the biodiversity net gain, which is also very interesting. I think it can be linked, but goes beyond, say, the credits and the carbon schemes, because it's about nature restoration. It's also, I don't know if you can say a little bit more, as could be interesting for our participants. Thanks.
Yeah, so the UK government at the beginning of 2024 introduced biodiversity net gain policy, which was what we would term a compliance market. So if you're losing habitat from a development, you have to offset that habitat and then create a positive net gain in addition to that. So to Sabine's point around just offsetting, this is a positive net gain. That can be up to 25% in some cases. So it's actually a measurable net gain. And generally, you're tending to lose lower distinctiveness habitats because you're penalized for losing really high quality habitats. And you're tending to offset those with really high distinctiveness habitats. So that transition of nature is increasing as you go through that process. That legal policy really creates that market. It creates that demand because people have to be able to buy those nature credits to be able to continue with their development process. So there's an immediate value that crystallizes in that regard. The voluntary markets we're finding are tending to get underpinned by those compliance markets. So we're really stressing to government how important those compliance markets, those mandatory markets are as a foundation for wider nature markets, particularly the carbon markets and some of the voluntary stuff that's going on. There are additional mechanisms that we think government could introduce, things like TNFD, so Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which would start to really give a bit more kind of oomph to the voluntary markets as well. Just being able to report on that nature loss within the corporate sector would, in our view, instantly kind of crystallize a a market for, what are you going to do about that? If you're reporting on a nature loss, shareholders will hold those organizations to account to do something about that. And that will, in our view, increase the demand for that voluntary sector. So there are things that governments can do with policy to kind of improve that. The flip side of that is the obstacles around this tend to come down to policy as well. So having long-term, stable and clear policies is absolutely critical to this, particularly as you're looking to integrate that investment in there as well. Investors want to know that that policy is in place for the long term, just as landowners need to know that that policy is in place for the long term. And we have these kind of short-term thinking across government cycles of 5 years and election cycles. So it's really important that some of these things are locked into place over the long term. But there's multiple benefits that come out of that as you're delivering these projects. We're Biodiversity Net Gain is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
There are multiple co-benefits around water security, water quality, river enhancement and the quality of our watercourses and things like that. The carbon sequestration as well as the biodiversity uplift that go kind of hand in glove with that. So actually, as you look at this kind of blended finance model where you're able to use some of these mandatory policies and then blend them with public money sitting alongside it, those co-benefits become really important to justify that public spend as well. And we're starting to see that come through some of the environmental land management schemes within the UK as well at the moment. So landscape recovery being at the top of the environmental land management piece. The first cohort of projects are just going through that process into implementation. So there's lots government can do. There's lots of money out there. It's just finding a way to kind of dovetail them together.
Thanks. I would just highlight. Thanks, Glenn. I would just highlight. I mean, what you said about the current framework. I think that there is a mandatory aspect to the entire architecture that is backing up the market, where the investors have to invest, and it's, as I said, it's offsetting, but it's not just compensation. But if I understood correctly, it's also there is a biodiversity net gain. So there is on top what needs to be invested by the investors, and this has to be coupled with also voluntary mechanisms, but there is a mandatory aspect, which is interesting to consider when also developing something with further development in the UK, but also in the EU. And what you said, I mean, long-term thinking, important for overall predictability. And it's an interesting point about disclosure and reporting on investors, because of course there are different developments also. We are now discussing about what needs to be reported, how, and by the corporate sector, and you have different views depending on what kind of exactly reporting or disclosure requirements we're talking about. It's very interesting to hear from you on this, and what role could these mechanisms play. Happy to come back for additional questions and comments, but for now I will stop here. Thank you, Glenn, and over to Alexandra Pelinska, Executive Director at Eurosif, to hear also a bit from the from the investments community. And also happy if you have anything to comment on what the speakers have said thus far, but I will start with the question on indeed how is nature currently being integrated into the investment strategies and financial decision making? How do you see this agenda from your perspective?
Thank you so much, Stefan, and hello everyone. Great pleasure to be here today. So indeed, representing here today the responsible and sustainability-oriented investor community. I mean, I'm very happy to also react on this very important topic. I think indeed a lot has been already said by the fellow panelists, and I think it is really clear that biodiversity and its decline is, well, basically. This creates an economic and systemic risk, of course, also affecting the investments. So there is clearly financial materiality connected to that. And I think that is, increasingly recognized by the investors that are, I would say, approaching it from two sides. So on one hand side, trying to better integrate biodiversity and nature-related considerations in the core financial risks management. And at the same time, I think increasingly are also looking at the impacts of the investments and how in the mid to long term it can also turn into financial risks. Sorry. So basically, yes, our economy is very heavily dependent on nature, and therefore its decline poses the risk to businesses and hence also investments. From the kind of integration of the biodiversity and nature into the risk management and portfolio analysis, there are, of course, different approaches looking at that. I think that, of course, the starting point is always the data, right? So the data on the investee companies that needs to be basically obtained by investors. On one hand side, I think what is always very positive is the fact that over the last years, there has been significant developments in terms of nature and biodiversity related standards and frameworks. Of course, including European sustainability reporting standards that are also covering nature and biodiversity, but also, well, now ISB, so international standards are also developing standards on biodiversity. We also have TNFD, etc. So this is, of course, a very good starting point.
I'm sorry, TNFD. Sorry, TNFD. Could you please specify? You mentioned TNFD.
Yes, sorry, the Task Force on Natural Related Financial Disclosures.
Okay. And this is at the EU level or more international?
This is an international framework. It's a little bit equivalent of TCFD, so the climate-related disclosures. But in any case, both TCFD and TNFD have been collaborating closely both with ISB, so International Sustainability Standard Board, as well as EFRAG in the context of developing European sustainability reporting standards. So I think what is positive is there has been, convergence between the different frameworks. But this way or another, I think, one of the challenges still kind of identified by investors is that compared, for instance, to climate-related disclosures, still in terms of biodiversity and nature-related disclosures, well, they are, I would say, still a little bit, more difficult to access. And maybe I would say the robustness, coverage, and availability is not as good as in case of climate, but hence, the developments of this framework standards and frameworks is very helpful. And especially at the European level, I think it is also kind of hoped and expected that the application of European sustainability reporting standards should help. But that, of course, is the first stage. And then I think, another element which honestly I believe that many investors are kind of struggling with is once you even have the data, how do you actually integrate it into your investment decisions? So this kind of like more risk analysis and also, for instance, how do you assess it, in terms of impacts? Of course, there are many ways to do that. And I think, some investors are more already doing it and more versed in doing it. But I think, this is indeed something that still needs to be promoted further. And this is something that we as EUROSIF, as part of the AURENI project, together with several of our member organizations, currently we also have a project at actually trying to promote the awareness among investors exactly about how to better integrate biodiversity and nature-related risks, as well as how to better take account of the positive and negative impacts. I think here again, in terms of data, maybe just coming back for a second, of course, the EU taxonomy also plays an important role, I think, in, I would say, creating, a path for I would say, helping investors better, I would say, assess the investee companies. But then once again, we need to also then look at how all of these considerations can be integrated into investment decision making, which of course then, some of the traditional approaches like screening and exclusions. So for instance, avoiding companies with deforestation exposure or harmful extractive practices, high negative biodiversity impact can be considered. Then, of course, the more traditional ESG risks integration. Also, for instance, adding biodiversity criteria into the ESG scoring, in the context of land use, water use, ecosystem impacts. And of course, there is also, I would say, many other, investment strategies, including also stewardship and engagement and engaging actually with the companies. Also maybe insisting they set up nature and biodiversity related targets, which of course is also one of the elements that have been discussed in the context of European sustainability reporting standards.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for these reflections on how we can go about it from the investor's point of view. And you talked about risk, integrating nature-related risks, and also accessing data, but also how to use data about nature in the decision-making process on how to finance, how to go about one's investments. Also, besides that, I'm interested if you have any other points on other EU instruments and their potential effectiveness or challenges. So we talked about already, for example, the role that InvestEU can play, the EIB guarantees, nature credits, also discussed the EU, but also what we heard from Glenn on what is happening in the UK, the green bonds. So it ties to the risk and accessing data and disclosure, and how we go about this information and how we integrate it into the different portfolios. But if there is anything else you would like to add on the EU instruments, what role they could play?
With pleasure. I mean, indeed, I think as already the previous speakers mentioned, I think there is a great potential now with the next multi-annual financial framework, the next basically EU's budget being negotiated. And this is indeed something we will be also looking at, from the kind of an investor perspective. And of course, here, I would say blended finance, de-risking mechanisms. Indeed, this is, a great way of incentivizing and mobilizing more private finance. Also to, I would say, protect biodiversity and nature and prevent further biodiversity degradation. Because, well, I think indeed, as already mentioned, there is a huge investment gap, right? So we need both public and private finance to support that. And indeed, through this kind of a blended finance, the risking mechanisms, so basically, using also the public finance to incentivize private finance is a great way to do that. I mean, indeed, private investors usually, well, they tend to also, follow profit at the end of the day. So on one hand side, of course, they want to properly manage the risks. I think they are also, increasingly seeking, I would say, positive impacts of the investments. But at the end of the day, as part of their fiduciary duty role, they also have to ensure that investments are bringing the positive returns. And hence, as a result, I think, like whenever also public finance can intervene, I would say, to support, I think that nature role, I would say, whenever actually we are talking about public good, which, well, at the end of the day, biodiversity and nature also is, I think this is very helpful. So indeed, there is a great role that now also public finance can play. And I think it would be great to, yes, utilize the Competitiveness Fund, the InvestEU, and other, I would say, vehicles to that end.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Indeed, it's good to think about the entire policy toolbox, so to speak, and what role it could play, but also look at the investors and everything that they need to account for, including also that they do wanna make sure that there is a business case, and that these different instruments can can play a role to that. And of course, we can discuss further on this. But I would like now to introduce our respondent. We heard from our panelists, and of course, I hope you also noted some of the points and comments, and happy to hear from our panelists if you have anything to add on top during the time we have left for this discussion. But yeah, we have with us today Eva Mayhofer, Head of Environment Policy Unit at the European Investment Bank. Eva, you must have heard us mention the EIB a couple of times in the last hour, talking about different instruments and different roles that also the institutions and instruments, including the role the EIB could play. So I'm curious about any immediate reactions to what you've heard from our panelists, or any comments or any questions you would like to pose before we also go back to before we turn to the audience. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, Stefan, and a very rich discussion. And I'm going to try to frame my response in also the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves, but also the strategic priorities, for example, of the European Investment Bank, that actually also reflect the strategic priorities of the EU. So one thing, I think generally in today's context, I think in order to gain wider political will, we need to stop treating biodiversity and ecosystem resilience as green or an environmental issue. It's not working, and we need to start framing it as a core economic infrastructure and national security for Europe. So just a couple of, I'd like to pick up on a couple of threads. First, I think we heard the underlying message: ecosystems, biodiversity is not a luxury, and ecosystems are productive assets. So we've got from the colleague from DG Agri that Europe's agriculture, fisheries, also our water systems, and even industrial supply chains depend directly on healthy soils, pollinators, forests, and stable climate patterns. So when biodiversity collapses, productivity drops, volatility rises, costs shift to government, and that's not environmental damage, that's economic fragility. And second, resilience is about risk management, we heard. We've learned also, I mean, just generally, we are experiencing this now, energy shocks and geopolitical tensions, that over-dependence on fragile ecosystems or systems creates strategic vulnerability. So nature loss works the same way. Degraded ecosystems amplify floods, droughts, fires, disease risks, and that translates into higher insurance costs. I think, Stefan, you mentioned that. Public spending, increased public spending, supply disruptions, security, in security terms, biodiversity loss is a threat multiplier. And then third, Europe has strategic advantage if it leads here. And we've heard some very good examples coming out from Glenn. By investing in nature-based solutions, restoration, regenerative agriculture, circular bioeconomy, we reduce long-term liabilities and create jobs, innovation, competitive industries. So this aligns directly with the goals of the EU around strategic autonomy and resilience. But this is not just about downside risk. It is also major capital allocation opportunities. Glenn mentioned there is enough funding. There is enough funding. There's enough capital. The capital markets are there. But nature restoration, regenerative agriculture, and water resilience are investable themes with long-term stable returns. So we need to start reframing, and the reframing is simple. Nature is infrastructure. Biodiversity is risk management, restoration is economic strategy. So by reframing biodiversity and ecosystem resilience not as environmental spending, which is right now the problem that we are facing, for example, in the European Parliament, within the MFF also, is because it's been seen as environmental spending, but it should be reframed as core to Europe's economic stability and risk architecture. And what really it is, because ultimately our economies don't sit outside of nature, they're embedded within. And so resilience is both in terms of policy, markets, and depends on recognizing that reality. So if we embed that into finance, our industrial planning policy, our defense planning even, not just within environmental ministries. We shift biodiversity from the margins to the center of Europe's security and prosperity agenda. So my question actually to the panelists is, what actions do we need to take so that that reality, so that we can actually reshape that reality and also influence then our investment priorities, having that embeddedness of biodiversity and nature, and so that we can also then finance at scale. So that's where I'm coming from. And then we, of course, as EIB, happy to support that.
Thank you very much, Eva, and also for again stressing some of the key messages also from yourself, but also from the panelists. And one of them is that the money is there. The question is how it's to be allocated, but this can arguably be linked to the way how the narrative around nature is being shaped, and making linkages that you said to and bringing in the concepts and the terms such as resilience and infrastructure and security, competitiveness, and not just as a lip service, but actually see how we can have a more holistic view on this, so that this is not perceived as just as a cost or something like a, I don't know, I mean, luxury item, or depends how people will see it or interpret it, but as an investment into our future, into a resilient economy and society, and to our competitiveness and security. And just to pick on what you said on defense, I mean, we've been wondering also at the EPC, you know, can we link this with defense spendings? Can nature play a role, and how can we make this happen? Can we be creative with unlocking different investment possibilities and also synergies to that, you know, can we have a cake and eat it too, in a nutshell, or to an extent? Indeed, I would be happy to discuss this further with the panel. But I would also add some questions that we received from the audience. For example, we had a question from, it says, an anonymous attendee. It's building on what Glenn presented. Building on what you mentioned about your experience with the land management scheme from the UK, how inspired should the EU be building on this scheme? Can there be any strong points that could be adopted by the EU framework, or what should we avoid building on that experience? So I think that's a more concrete question that I would be interested to hear from Joanna, if you could maybe shed any light on this. But we can start with you at least. But also, when it comes to the to other speakers, please raise your hand proactively if you want to add something to this or any other comments, so you know we can keep it more flexible or interactive. But Joanna, maybe you could start. We could start with you.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Well, Glenn's example is very inspiring, and we need to look into ways that we make it happen through the new MFF and the revised CAP policy. What I would put as an aspect is that whatever we do, especially under the CAP agricultural policy, we share it with member states. So we should not forget that national administrations are also an important player, and they need to take the initiatives that we frame within our policy, because we remain under shared management. But I agree that we have to create this framework. We move now to more incentive-based, because if we only impose, I take the perspective of the farming community, if we only impose requirements and there is no market uptake after that, then we see this gap, and implementation would not follow at the scale that we want. So yeah, I would agree that we need to be inspired with such cases and integrate them better in our policy with different mechanisms, and especially with trying to link this catalytic effect of public funding through the agri-food value chain.
Thank you very much.
Just a short reflection, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And Glenn, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, it was more of a kind of a personal reflection of that kind of journey between, the UK coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy and that kind of, from a farmer's perspective, the sheer alarm that caused with the subsidies going, and then, 6 years on, looking back on that, and that, I think my understanding now is that actually that subsidy regime is not that efficient. It does some good for nature, so through agri-environment, but actually most agri-environment schemes are at the farmer's convenient. They're not strategic. They don't necessarily work on a kind of a catchment function. And I think as I look back, I think that, the years of subsidies were probably not that good a use of public money. They could have been more efficient. They could have been more effective in what they were delivering. And I think we've sort of transitioned from subsidies to a blend of finance between public and private, which creates a much better cost benefit ratio for the public purse. So the more that you can leverage that private finance in there, and that can do more of the heavy lifting as nature markets kind of become less nascent over time, then and everybody gets a bit more confidence, then I think it becomes much better value for the public purse. It enables that money to go much further in terms of what it's delivering for nature as well. So, if you'd have asked me 6 or 7 years ago, I would have fought against losing subsidies and the cap, but we have a completely different mindset. We're looking through a completely new lens now, where we sort of look back and think that was probably all a bit inefficient, and there are better ways of doing it.
Thank you. Sabine, I see you also have a reaction to this.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I actually wanted to react to the question that Eva put on the table, and actually I very much agree with the analysis that nature should not be considered as something green for tree huggers, etc. Although nothing against, I'm also myself a bit in that perspective a tree hugger. However, what we see currently at the political level in the EU is unfortunately exactly the opposite, because many political voices are using the competitiveness agenda and the geopolitical context to say that actually nature legislation is red tape and is a burden for our competitiveness, and they don't have this long-term perspective. So on the question on what needs to be done, I would like to encourage everybody to also make your voice heard. Not only NGOs should speak up against it, because it's not convincing. So we really need all the private sector also to embrace it. So thank you, Eva, for also putting it out there.
Maybe the question is not whether to hug trees, but how to do it effectively, or how to bring more people to do it. And it's about indeed the narrative and the discussion itself, but of course bearing in mind the ambitions that we have initially. Indeed, happy to hear from you on this question, but also what Eva was asking for the first place. If you have any additional comments on this. I see Alexandra, you raised your hand. Maybe we can start with you.
Thank you, Stefan. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to say that you are very right, and I think that's why it's important to have the debates like today, and have so many excellent speakers, sharing actually their perspectives. But I think sometimes it's maybe also the question of promoting certain things which might be also obvious for those already working on the field, but maybe not so obvious for everyone. So also like, well, once again, why is it important? Also, I think the interconnectedness between actually climate and biodiversity and nature. Because I think sometimes within different frameworks, we kind of disconnected, right? Maybe we disconnected because we want to have, clear, I don't know, methodologies. But I think sometimes it creates this kind of like sort of artificial barriers, right? So you have a standard on climate, you have on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and another one on biodiversity and nature. But the bottom line is like it's all extremely interconnected, right? So the thing is, at the end of the day, forests are essential for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I would say the strength of the forest also depends on the biodiversity. So it's, I think we just, well, basically, yes, all of us need to kind of spread the word. And also, again, I think keep promoting the tools that everyone can use. And exactly, I think what has been also mentioned about the fact that, yes, this is not really about doing good. It's actually about economic and financial resilience. This is also about the fact that, well, all of us, including businesses and investors, we are dependent on nature. So if we actually destroy it, there is no planet B, we're not going to be making any more money, right? So it might sound a little bit like a cliche, but I think it is, still, I would say, worth talking about.
No, thanks, Alexandra. No, indeed, it's something that is work in progress and trying to strengthen these linkages. So definitely worth mentioning it over and over again. And Joanna?
Yes, I just wanted to reflect on what Glenn said, and it's very interesting that actually, well, a factor, Brexit, made his business case different and made him less dependent from subsidies. So exactly in my work, we are trying to see how we can balance the toolbox that we provide under the Common Agricultural Policy. Of course, income support is important. This is the baseline. We should have it to some extent, but we are really trying to actively promote the use of other type of instruments, as I said, like financial instruments within the member states, and we have them now programmed in half of the European Union. And we see that this brings much more flexibility in this complex environment of how farmers could become more sustainable and resilient. And it also reduces a bit the dependency on subsidies. So along with what we already have as agro-environmental schemes, green investments, eco schemes, we need to really push a bit the demand also in programming other more innovative tools such as the financial instruments. Just a reflection.
Thanks. Thanks, Jana, very much appreciated. I wanted also to come, so also one of our attendants, Cyril Jus, shared an interesting link that maybe we could bear in mind, but also there is a more concrete question by Gaspard Rode on the simplification agenda. And I would like to maybe pose this question to Alexandra in particular, because we talked about disclosure and access to data, but we also have the simplification agenda, which is very much about simplified also reporting requirements from companies. And how do we go about these different requests and different processes? Can they go along, or how can they complement each other, or how they not to make them contradict each other? Because I think we have on the one hand, let's say, if we turn it into a black and white discussion, which it's not necessarily the case, but if we to simplify it, from my angle, people, let's say, different actors don't necessarily want to share all the data, or they or not under depending on the conditions, but then you also need data to make assessments to make the. I'm sorry. I hope you can hear me and see me well. I think there was Yeah, so
I
I think
think
there was some
we
issue.
lost you for like a couple of
Yes,
seconds, but you're back now, and I
there,
think we have heard most of what you said.
yes, sorry, there was apparently some connectivity issue. But yeah, just saying on simplification agenda and the importance of data, if you have any, if you can
Sure.
share any insights or reflections on your end, Alexandra, thanks.
Yeah, and I'm more than happy to do so. And I think it's very good that you bring it up. Indeed, I think we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And well, at the end of the day, I think there is a possibility to achieve simplification while also ensuring that we keep the most important disclosures, especially from the kind of a investment and financial perspective. And that, of course, includes disclosures on nature and biodiversity. I think in this context, maybe I would like to share two key messages, because currently the Commission is, I would say, considering EFRAG proposals for the simplified European Sustainability Reporting Standard, consulting different bodies and also different DGs. And I also know that there is a fair amount of lobbying, I would say, on trying maybe to also remove certain points like nature-related and biodiversity-related transition plans, which, as we just discussed, are very important to keep, as well as imagine microplastics, disclosures around microplastics, which honestly is quite astonishing in a sense that, of course, it is relevant only for companies from sectors, but indeed, whenever it is relevant, it should be reporting on, given how, I would say, how big is the impact of the microplastics actually on our health, on the biodiversity, oceans, everything. So at the end of the day, I think it is really crucial, and we really need to keep that in mind. Then another element is, of course, the fact that through the simplification agenda, through the Omnibus 1, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive already, its scope has been significantly reduced. So now it's basically, grosso modo, companies with more than 1,000 employees that will actually, and well, there is also a certain threshold connected to the turnover, which is well at a high level. So it's only very large companies that will be now required to report sustainability-related disclosures. But I think this is, yet another element, just for companies that are also smaller than that, to keep in mind, like, look, investors and banks need this data anyway. You're going to be actually approached anyway. Commission has also already adopted in a form of recommendation that eventually will be also published in a form of also created, hence the voluntary standard for, so-called SMEs, but that will also apply for, basically companies that are not SMEs or not so small anymore, but basically outside the scope of Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And all I would like to say is just encourage actually as many companies of different sizes, like, look, please make at least, small steps towards actually the reporting by providing the information which is relevant for your business and indeed, investors and stakeholders.
Thank you, Alexandra, for some additional insights on this and how we can go about these two agendas and how we can interlink them. Indeed, that it's important to be inclusive and to see what are the prospects, what are the challenges, but to kind of slowly also induce a system where we can have more access to information and data that we need to make the right decisions looking ahead. And of course, the details matter a lot, but we need to also to recognize the importance of data disclosure. I don't know if there are any other comments from other speakers. I don't know. I'm looking at Sabine. Maybe if you have any comments on this, on the simplification agenda and our ambitions on nature restoration, nature positive action, for example.
Well, I think it's, as I said already before, we are very concerned actually with the current simplification agenda, because for us it's of course good to try to see where can we be more effective. We don't want unnecessary bureaucracy either, but as Alexandra also mentioned, the result of the first omnibus on the corporate reporting and due diligence, etc., clearly led to a weakening of the bar. The bar has been significantly lowered, and we see this with many files, also in the EU deforestation law, for instance, with the continued delays and changes, and the Water Framework Directive, which is announced to be revised. So we see on a lot of topics actually a big risk of weakening of very important environmental protections. And as we already mentioned, not only important for nature, but also for public health and also for the economy, because indeed many companies depend on healthy ecosystems and the services they deliver for their business. So we are very concerned about these developments.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabine. Eva, you wanted to comment?
Yes, I think, I mean, simplification shouldn't be exactly as Sabine just said. Simplification should not mean dilution of standards. And we're seeing that actually happening. Also, especially the nature laws, whether we look at the Habitats Birds Directive or Water Framework Directive, are being looked at in isolation. And just be thinking that reducing those standards or diluting the standards means that we are actually simplifying without actually looking at, okay, what is the administrative burden from a permitting process. It has also led to a lot of policy incoherence, instability, meaning that also member states are struggling with understanding what are they supposed to do, and without looking at what are the priorities and seeing how these pieces of legislation are actually supporting the economy or Europe's competitive, or making it more resilient. So I think this is really important, but also in terms of a risk management perspective, if there is no reporting anymore, we don't get the data, and we are unable as financial institutions to actually assess the risks in our portfolio. We have these discussions regularly also with the ECB, and the ECB also being or the supervisory bodies being very concerned that they are not then getting the data needed to understand, okay, what are the risks to financial stability if we again reduce and dilute the reporting, and that for the underlying data that gets sent to them. So there are, yes, simplification, but simplification needs to be done intelligently.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva. Yes, so good to hear also on your end how on the simplification and on the data and the importance of accessing having access to data, and and of course to see how we can develop this process, if I could then add, in a efficient way, convenient way, but that data is important. Glenn, I saw you raise your hand. Then I think you it's not the case now, but still curious if you would like to add anything on this or any other reflection.
Yeah, I mean, Eva almost made the same point, but just one thing to add on that was around the success of biodiversity net gain, which is fairly an infant policy, but the biggest success of it so far is not the money that's coming into nature restoration. It's actually the avoided losses in the first place. So because of the way that policy works, it's very expensive for developers to lose high distinctiveness habitats. So they're redesigning their schemes to avoid those losses in the first place. So those really high quality areas of habitat, which would previously have just been bulldozed, they're now thinking about that and working around it, and we're not losing the really high quality habitat in the first place. And I think that's probably the biggest success. The second success is obviously that income or that revenue stream coming into nature, which then catalyzes wider investment into nature markets, etc.
Thanks, Glenn. And also just to ask you, or actually come back to you later because I have a related question on the EU policy. So I would like to hear from Joanna first.
I want to add a remark on the simplification agenda, that from our perspective, we look at what is the burden created on the farmer, because when companies provide data, they ultimately need to go down to the farm level and take the raw data, right? So this is also a challenge we currently see with some multiplication of sustainability standards, certification schemes, reporting requirements that additionally add to this burden on the farmer. And we are currently working on a new mechanism, the so-called on-farm sustainability compass, just to try to help the farmer when to see actually what could be this process of on-farm sustainability assessment, and how do we create it, how we get the information related to, well, not only environmental but also economic and social sustainability aspects into his farming decisions, and how this could be also shared later on with the value chain. Yeah, I can give more insights if someone wants to hear more on this later.
Oh, if we happy to consider that, or to see how much if we can add something, given that we are approaching the end of this discussion. But of course, we can always follow up and continue the discussion also in that way. But we had also a question by Pauline when it comes to the what's upcoming in terms of the what's coming up next when it comes to the EU instruments, policies. That what should we expect, or are there any notable milestones to be mindful of in the next 12 months? I would say also looking at the next year that are important for nature financing, but also I would say more broadly for nature restoration, nature positive action. And this is what I wanted to start with by Glenn, by asking you a kind of similar question as to what are your expectations, what would be some interesting developments on the UK land management scheme to begin for you, but also for EU stakeholders to look at in the future, so we can draw these comparisons and see how can the EU also, what are the lessons learned, or what the EU potentially adopt or be mindful of when it comes to the UK approach to nature financing. So let's start from that, and then we come back to other speakers also in your reflections on this. So please, Glenn.
Yeah, no problem. So I think that the UK can be used as a great exemplar for how these systems work. I think under the landscape recovery scheme, those projects are just going through to implementation now. So like any markets, they're built around confidence, and I think it's really important that the markets gain confidence from these early schemes, and also the landowners gain confidence around some of the legal mechanisms, the long-termness of these schemes as well. So I guess to some extent the proof will be in the pudding over the next few years as to how these ramp up. I think it's also really important that government get confidence from these as well, as we're looking at these kind of blended finance scenarios with some of the projects. They're asking government to kind of backstop emerging markets as well. So some of the voluntary biodiversity markets, for example, government has a role to play in there if they want to, of being a backstop, a bit like the energy markets have worked with the contract for difference and things like that. So there are existing mechanisms within government policy that I think that we can start to introduce into nature markets, which give everybody an element of security and de-risk it to some extent for both landowners and for potential buyers and investors and debt providers coming into that space. And also it de-risks it for government as well, because they're sharing the burden with the private finance side of things. So that we see massive potential in this. The projects are well positioned. They will start to be implemented in the next few months and go through that period of implementation. In terms of your question around, or Sabine's question around the kind of the voluntary markets versus compliance markets, totally agree with that. I think it's important to underpin some of this with policy and legal mechanisms. It will be really interesting to see what happens in Scotland, because biodiversity net gain is only in England, and they are looking at implementing biodiversity net gain in Scotland quite soon. My understanding is that that will be a voluntary system as opposed to mandatory. So it'll be really interesting to see if that works and how that works in comparison to the English system. And I think there's potential learnings for the EU in that, as well as to how effective some of those kind of new policies are.
Thank you very much, Len, for shedding light on these upcoming things that we could look forward to, and also the additional comments. Maybe just we received one more question that I could bring in from Daniel Bradley, just maybe more broadly, and just like a brief comment on your side, just bearing in mind what we discussed thus far on sustainable farming more broadly. Do you see it as being something that can be both profitable and sustainable at the moment, or can you see nature as a net benefit, just taking stock of the current or your current experience or any future expectations?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think this is ultimately about land use optimization. I think we've seen, since the war, we've seen big areas of land that are underpinned on a high input system, which are not sustainable. I think that then drags down the more efficient parts of the farm businesses, which should be used for growing food. I think there's an element of, it's a horrible word, but sustainable intensification on some of those areas as well, and getting the balance right in land use between farming and nature. And I think there's also an opportunity for a big transition towards more regenerative farming across the board. So as we start to look at entire catchments and amplifying and aggregating some of that regenerative farm practices, then I think that we can start to see additional income streams replacing some of that cap money in the UK through payments for ecosystem services, through a transition towards regenerative. That depends. That's slightly reliant on the supply chain playing ball with that as well, and particularly when you get through to Scope 3 emissions and things like that, that there's a fair share on the value of carbon and some of those other ecosystem services through that transition in farm practice. Yeah, 100%. We absolutely see that, and that's what we're advocating in some of the landscape recovery projects. That this is a whole farm approach. It's not just about nature or farming.
No.
It's holistic across the board.
No, thanks for this message to look to. Good to keep in mind, and how there is a prospect and further opportunities also building on the current experience. Now, I would like to then just pose a simple and same question as to what you're expecting when it comes to other speakers. What do you expect from the upcoming EU policies and developments? So again, any interesting milestones from your perspective we should consider, and any. But I would say, just in a sentence or two, any key messages on your end, what the EU policies should be about in the future, how we can shape them, bearing in mind also what Eva said about the more holistic narrative, but generally, what are your messages on what the EU can do, should do to enable financing, greater financing or nature positive action in the EU? And maybe, Joanna, we can start with you. Of course, you are the institution, but any key messages before we finish?
Thanks for this very interesting discussions. I also heard a lot of interesting ideas that will, of course, take away as messages back in our DG. But as a concluding remark, and from what I already said, the role of public funding in the future will best fit if we use it as a catalyst for private investments, and also if we look more into the agri-food value chain, how it works, how market incentives could be further supported, maybe through EU public guarantees. This could be a working scenario also to support nature positive action and to gain this biodiversity net gain that Glenn was also talking about.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And Sabine?
Thank you. I think I already discussed our concerns on the proposal for the next MFF and concerns about the weakening of the environmental and nature legislation that we see in the context of the simplification agenda. So maybe to bring something new, which is a bit a more positive perspective, I'm very much looking forward to the 1st of September, which is the deadline when the member states will need to submit their draft national restoration plans, because I think this will be a key moment where also funders and investors can have a look at what are the projects that are planned for the coming years to bring nature back in Europe, and maybe how can this be also funded also via private investments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for your reflections on this. And Alexandra?
Thank you. I would like to echo the comments on the MFF. Let's make the best use of these current negotiations to ensure there is also sufficient funding to protect biodiversity and nature, and indeed create good incentives for investors and banks. Indeed, I think what Sabine mentioned is quite important about the national nature restoration plans. Then please let's safeguard the European sustainability reporting standards and the biodiversity and nature related disclosures there. Look, there are also many other elements, like for instance, the ongoing sustainable finance disclosure regulation review. In the principal adverse impact indicators, currently there is one on biodiversity and another one, I believe, on water. There are also some about radioactive waste and some others. I understand there is actually quite a big push to remove the PAIs. We're trying to ensure that at least some at the product level can be maintained, even if they could be a bit reformed. So indeed, let's take this opportunity to create meaningful disclosures and indicators there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And last but not the least, Eva, maybe any final messages before we close this session?
No, I think we are looking at different entry points of European policy, and one of them for us, which is key, is the new EU adaptation strategy or action plan. And I think there we will see a lot of synergies with ecosystem resilience. And if we can there fund and look at scaling up interventions in whether it's nature-based solutions, ecosystem resilience and restoration, I think we end up being a lot more impactful and at scale.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Indeed, there is plenty of initiative to expect and to look forward to, be it on, let's say, more nature-related legislation and financing, but also related instruments and agendas, let's say, on adaptation and how we can link it with nature, on data disclosure and different initiatives. And again, highlighting what Eva said in the beginning also, that we need to think about it in a holistic way, and that and how does nature fit into different agendas, and of course being strong on this agenda itself. So I would on that end like to close this discussion for today, but of course we look forward to having these discussion exchanges in the future. I think we managed to cover a lot of ground today, and indeed identify some prospects and challenges with addressing one of the main challenges with ensuring that we have healthy ecosystems and that we have nature restoration and nature protection at this adequate state, and which is the question around how we bridge that financing gap with public-private and blended finance, and what is the role of the EU, but also looking into other initiatives in development, example in the UK, and how we can learn from each other. I think is very, very important looking ahead, because as we can see, financing is scarce, and there is money, but also there are also trade-offs, and also it's a way how do we make the most out of it from different sources. And in that sense, it's important to have this discussion, and we look forward to having them also in the future, as I mentioned. So I would really like to thank our speakers for very interesting and very insightful remarks and interventions, and also to our participants for your attendance and for your questions. Thank you once again. Looking forward to this discussion again, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.